Hello, and welcome to the third webinar of the year for the Canadian Sustainability Indicators Network. CSIN is a network of about 200 professionals who work in government, in non-for-profits, and the private sectors who work with and have an interest in sustainability indicators. The network is supported in part by Environment and Climate Change Canada. My name is Jennifer Temmer, and I am the CSIN coordinator and a project manager with the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Please note that today's presentation will be recorded and it'll be made available along with any related presentation materials after the event. If you would like a copy of the presentation, but you're not currently on the CSIN email list, you can contact me at my email address on the screen, jtemmer@iisd.ca. Today's webinar will run from 11:30 a.m. until 1 p.m. Central Time. We've done that in order to be able to make time for a little bit of an extended question and answer period. The presentations will last about 50 minutes with time for questions afterwards. If you do have a question or a comment at any point, you can type it into the question and the Q&A box, and I will moderate all of the questions after the presentations are finished. If you have any technical issues, you can send me a message in the chat box, or you can, again, send me an email at jtemmer@iisd.ca, and I will see what I can do to help you out. In this webinar, we're going to learn about measuring resilience. Dinah Timbalo will share with us the Government of Saskatchewan's Climate Resilience Measurement Framework, and Kevin Summers will unpack his work with the Environmental Protection Agency's work on climate resilience screening and index. Dinah Timbalo is the acting landscape sustainability lead for the cumulative impacts and science branch with the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment. Before joining the Government of Saskatchewan, she worked as a bench scientist at the University of Calgary and the University of Regina. Dinah holds a BSc, an MSc, and a PhD in biology and is currently pursuing her master's in public policy. Kevin Summers is the Associate Director of Science at the Gulf Ecology Division of the Office of Research and Development's National Health and Environmental Effects Research Laboratory. At present, he is working with colleagues in the Sustainable and Healthy Communities program to develop an index of human well-being that can be related to changes in ecosystem services, and leads this effort's Indicator and Indices Development Project. Dr. Summers holds a BA in Zoology and Psychology, an MA in Ecology, and a PhD in Systems Ecology and Biology. So today we're going to start with Dinah Timbalo's presentation, and I'm going to pass over the control of the screen to her at this point. So Dinah, if you're able to share your screen and unmute yourself, we can get started with the presentation.
Hi, Jennifer. Thank you for the introduction. So I just shared my screen, so hopefully it's showing right now.
Yes, it looks great.
Okay, thank you. And first, I would like to thank IISD and the Canadian Sustainability of Indicators Network for this opportunity to present Saskatchewan's Climate Resilience Measurement Framework. I've been involved quite well in this work since I joined the Ministry of Environment back in 2017. That's just a while ago, actually. So the next slide, if I could move it here. Okay, did that work? Slide number 2 presents the outline of my talk. So I will begin by describing the key economic sectors in the province of Saskatchewan. Then I will provide a background for the framework, present some information on why and how it was developed. I will spend some time describing the framework, providing a few examples of measures and their corresponding targets. And then I will present our reporting approach, and I will end up with a summary slide. So for those of you who are not familiar with the province of Saskatchewan, Saskatchewan is a growing agricultural and resource-based economy. Shown in this slide are the key economic sectors. So We have agriculture, forestry, energy, and mining. So for agriculture, 40% of Canada's cultivated farmland are located in Saskatchewan. We grow about 50% of Canada's total canola production, and Saskatchewan is the world's top exporter of lentils and dried peas. For forestry, over half of Saskatchewan is forested. It's in the northern part of the province, and about 12 million hectares would be commercial forests. Under energy, Saskatchewan produces more than 1/3 of Canada's primary energy. That would include oil and natural gas. And mining is also an important industry for the province, and Saskatchewan is the largest potash industry in the world. So to provide a little bit of background, I'll start by describing the climate change strategy for the province. So the government of Saskatchewan recognized the need to prepare for the impacts of climate change, and it has developed and released its climate change strategy in December 2017. And the document is entitled Prairie Resilience, a Made in Saskatchewan Climate Change Strategy. So for us here in Saskatchewan, we define resilience as the ability to cope with, adapt to, and recover from stress and change. So resilience is the overarching focus of the province's climate change strategy. And because of that, the climate change strategy is not limited to actions that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it also focuses on climate change adaptation and ways on how we could increase resilience, not only to the climatic or environmental impacts of climate change, but to the economic impacts of climate change as well. So the climate change strategy, it includes more than 40 commitments in 5 key areas, shown in the bullets in this slide. The first one is natural systems, followed by physical infrastructure, economic sustainability, community preparedness, and the last bullet is about measuring and reporting. So this includes both reporting by industries on their GHG emissions, as well as reporting by the government of Saskatchewan on its progress in increasing its resilience. And part of this is the climate resilience measurement framework. Now, I should mention that the climate change strategy and the framework are both provincial government-wide initiative. So the Ministry of Environment, where I work at, is the lead agency, but we work with about 13 ministries, agencies, and crown corporations across the government of Saskatchewan. So how is climate resilience measured? We do recognize that climate resilience is multidimensional, so we need to strengthen multiple systems. And the framework was developed, was informed by a capital asset approach, wherein you have 5 different capitals. So these capitals are considered key determinants to overall resilience. And the 5 major forms would be natural, physical, economic, social, and human capital. So each capital can be measured by a combination of different measures, and therefore the framework includes 5 key areas with multiple measures. Now, it was also important for us to set targets for each measure. Setting targets and tracking progress would help the government in taking more actions to support resilience. So we have developed quantitative targets for each measure, and we will report on our progress every year. Selecting measures. So during selection of measures, we had a few considerations, including the 4 bullets in this slide. The first one is that we made sure that the measures are reflecting how resilient we are to climate change rather than measuring the climate change impacts. So what I mean by this is that, for example, instead of reporting on the number of wildfires, the framework reflects the capacity to prepare for wildfires, such as having emergency preparedness plans and fuel management to reduce fire risks. Second is we designed the framework so we have measures across all 5 key areas. And the third one is about data availability. And I think everyone in this webinar appreciates the importance of this one because we can only measure and report our progress if there is data infrastructure. We've also considered reliability and timeliness. Again, this is key because we are reporting every year. We also look at the resources for tracking and reporting because we need to ensure that we have a relevant set of measures that is manageable. And lastly, the selection of measures was informed by sectoral experts and stakeholders. So what I mean with sectoral experts would be technical experts working in the provincial government. Say, for example, experts that we work with from Ministry of Agriculture and Ministry of Highways and Infrastructure. We also conducted a series of stakeholder engagement, which began in February, and we did this up to September of 2018. So it was about a year of stakeholder engagement. So we started engagement with plenary sessions in February and March of 2018, where we presented our proposed approach for the framework, as well as an initial set of measures. And I think at the time we had about 70 measures. And then after the plenary sessions, we spent the months of March up to June preparing the draft framework. And then we went back to stakeholders and then presented the framework as well as a set of measures. And then from July to September 2018, we also did engagement with First Nations and Métis communities, as well as bilateral meetings with stakeholders. So the stakeholders in this case included academics, environmental NGOs, businesses, and municipal organizations. So this represents the framework. It was released in November 2018, and there are 5 key areas under the framework, represented by the 5 circles in the figure on your right. So we have natural systems, economic sustainability, physical infrastructure, community preparedness, and human well-being. What we're also showing here, the interlocking circles, this represents the 5 areas being interconnected, and that there are interactions between the different areas, and there could be co-benefits from each other. So for example, how we manage our natural resources would not only provide habitat for plants and animals, but it would also support the province's economy and the quality of life for Saskatchewan residents. Shown in this slide are the different types of capacities that we'd like to capture in the framework. So we have absorptive capacity, adaptive capacity, and transformative capacity. This is quite a busy slide, but I'll walk through it. So for absorptive capacity, this refers to the ability of a system to prepare for, manage, and recover from climate change impacts. So this one basically refers to our reactive capacity. An example would be having a flood insurance system, so you can rebuild your house or your property in the event that it is damaged by flooding. Now, the next type of capacity is adaptive capacity. This moves the bar a little bit higher. So this capacity refers to the ability to learn and adjust after a disaster event, and it involves making deliberate and planned decisions. So again, going back to the same example, instead of relying on your flood insurance, you could probably make changes on your house or your property, so flood-proof your property so it is less impacted by flooding. The third type of capacity, transformative capacity, it's more blue sky thinking, and it is beyond incremental changes. So it refers to the ability of a system to holistically and fundamentally change its characteristics and actions. Again, this goes beyond incremental adjustments. For example, again, related to flooding, the government can probably develop and implement zoning bylaws that would prevent developers from building houses in a floodway.
Dinah, can I just interrupt you for a second?
Yep.
Sorry, could you possibly put the screen on full screen?
Okay, I'll try to do that, and I'll go view.
If you go, yeah.
Okay.
It should be the arrow in the middle.
I think I should go.
Yeah, there you go.
Cut.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, thanks.
So you could probably look at the 3 types of capacities in a continuum. So at the bottom of the slide, you see a double arrow there. And it's showing that when you move from being absorptive to transformative, you're reducing your vulnerability to climate change impacts. So the more transformative you are, the more resilient you are to climate change impacts. And the framework aims to strengthen all types of capacities, but we want to focus more on the adaptive and transformative capacities. So this slide shows the measures included in the framework. Again, this is a busy slide, but I'll try to walk through the different measures. So we have a total of 25 measures, 4 to 7 measures per key area. Under Area 1, Natural Systems, we have 5 measures, and it includes management of grasslands, reflected by measure number 1, agricultural land, reflected in measures 2 and 3, forest, as reflected in measure number 4, and protected areas represented by measure number 5. Under physical infrastructure, we have 7 measures, and this involve building resilience in infrastructure such as culverts in national highway system. It represents the electricity sector and government buildings, so M11 and M12, monitors efficiency in government operations, and it demonstrates government leadership. Area number 3, economic sustainability, has 5 measures that demonstrate economic growth along with the commitment to reduce GHG emissions. So this area covers different sectors such as oil and gas, agriculture, and forestry. The 4th area is community preparedness, and there are 4 measures, and this would include floodplain mapping, having emergency preparedness plans for communities, and wildfire fuel management to reduce risk of wildfires. Under Area 5, human well-being, we have 4 measures, and this covers availability of water, water use efficiency, and public health. This is represented by M24 and 25, which is about surveillance systems for vector-borne diseases. Now, in the previous slide where I've shown the 3 types of capacities, I indicated that we're trying to focus on being adaptive and transformative. And I've color-coded the measures here. So the blue ones would represent the adaptive measures. The green one would represent transformative, and the red one would be absorptive. So as you can see right away, we have more of the adaptive and transformative capacity, and we have, I think, 5 absorptive capacity. So this slide and the next 4 slides, I will provide an example of a measure for each area. So under natural systems, we have the total amount of soil organic matter that is sequestered in Saskatchewan's cultivated land. So the soil organic matter would increase resulting from changes in agricultural practices such as adoption of reduced till or no-till by farmers. So we're classifying this measure as adaptive capacity because farmers are making deliberate decisions to change their farming practice. Now, we've also provided information on how the measure contributes to resilience. So soil organic matter improves soil quality, which eventually leads to higher agricultural productivity. SOM would also contain soil organic carbon, so it also represents the amount of carbon dioxide that is sequestered in the soil. So it contributes to GHG emissions reduction. And the specific target for this measure is to maintain sequestration rate at 5.6 million tons SOM per year. This is an example of a measure under physical infrastructure. So measure number 7 is Saskatchewan's renewable energy generation capacity. And we have classified this as a measure of transformative capacity because it reflects a major change in electricity generation. So we want to be less dependent on fossil fuels and increase the capacity for renewables. In terms of contribution to resilience, This contributes by lowering the province's GHG emissions. And as well, if you are increasing the diversity of energy sources, you are also increasing the resilience of the system itself. The specific target for this measure is that by 2030, 40 to 50% of electrical generation capacity from renewable energy sources will be achieved. Under economic sustainability, the example of measure is emissions intensity of Saskatchewan's economy, and the unit is GHGs per GDP. Now, we've classified this as a measure of transformative capacity because this demonstrates the ability to balance both economic growth and our commitment to reduce GHG emissions. And the target is to have a continued decrease in the emissions intensity of Saskatchewan's economy. Area number 4, community preparedness. The example here is measure number 20. So we have number of wildfire pre-plans completed for at-risk northern communities. So just to provide a quick background on this measure, the Ministry of Environment conducts wildfire risk assessment of communities in the wildland-urban interface. So these are the communities located in the northern part of the province. And the ministry has identified 86 communities that have moderate to high risk of wildfire. And these are the communities that would need wildfire operational pre-plans. And so the target for this measure is to complete the operational pre-plans for all 86 at-risk communities by 2030. Now, the last area is human well-being. The example of measure is measure number 24, number of communities where active surveillance for West Nile virus and other mosquito-borne diseases occur. So we've included a measure for vector-borne diseases because there's a risk for this one because of warmer temperatures. And we have classified this measure as indicating absorptive capacity because it involves surveillance and monitoring. And the specific target is to increase the number of communities with surveillance for mosquito-borne diseases to 20 communities by year 2020. Now, moving to the reporting approach, as I've said earlier, we committed to releasing reports every year, and the annual report for 2019 has been initiated, and the report should be available very soon. So we're going to report on individual measures, and our approach is to provide historical trend if we have the data. And we're also going to be providing the current status of the measure in relation to its target. So as an example, this shows the data for measure number 2 on soil organic matter sequestered in Saskatchewan's cultivated lands. So the data points that you can see in the graph are from 1990 to 2016, and the target is represented by the broken line at the bottom. So again, the target is to maintain at 5.6 million metric tons of soil organic matter every year. And as you can see in the graph here, the rate of sequestration has significantly increased from year 1992 up to about year 2005, and has remained constant until the last reporting year of 2016. So, stakeholders, when we did the stakeholder engagement, they've expressed that they wanted to have a simple approach to reporting and the province report on individual measures. So in addition to reporting on individual measures, as I've shown in the previous slide with the graph, we're also going to present a snapshot of progress for all 25 measures. And we are using a traffic light approach. So basically you use green for good, yellow for fair, and red for poor performance. Now, continuing on the example on soil organic matter, again, the soil sequestration rate has been maintained, and the current status is very close to the target. So this measure gets a good mark. So we're putting a green circle for this one, reflecting a good status. So again, we will reflect all the measures in the snapshot, and this information should be included in our annual report. Okay, this brings me to my summary slide. So to quickly summarize, Saskatchewan's measurement framework has a broad scope. So it includes 5 key areas. We have natural systems, physical infrastructure, economic sustainability, community preparedness, and human well-being. And each area has a set of measures. The province of Saskatchewan is also committed to reporting on all measures annually, and this is to demonstrate how we are building our resilience to climate change impacts. And this also provides us an opportunity to review certain programs or policies so we could make adjustments where it's needed. Now, the website at the bottom, this would contain the Prairie Resilience Climate Change Strategy and progress updates on legislation, regulations, and related standards for those of you who would be interested. But and also our progress report will be available on this website. And I think that ends my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions at the end of towards the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dinah. Kevin, if you are available and can share your slides, then we can learn a little bit about the Climate Resilience Screening Index.
And has that shared?
You should have, you should be able to share at the bottom of your screen. In the very middle, there's a green square with an arrow icon.
Yeah, it was waiting till the other one was unshared, I think.
Ah.
Oh.
Perfect.
Have you got it now?
Yes, thank you.
And does that make it full screen?
That makes it full screen.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are. And I want to thank you for inviting us as representatives of the Environmental Protection Agency to share with you the work that we've done, excuse me, over the last couple of years with what we call CRISI, the Climate Resilience Screening Index, and its development and application. You'll see a lot of similarities with the previous demonstration, although the approach is different. Many of the types of information that are used are very similar. I'd like to acknowledge my cohorts in crime here, Lisa Smith, Linda Harwell, and Kyle Buck, and we're located in the Office of Research Development in Gulf Breeze, Florida. Much like the last presentation, I'll start with a definition for resilience. We look at it as the capacity to prepare for disruptions, recover from shocks and stresses, and adapt and grow from that disruptive experience. And you'll see that that's very similar to what was previously discussed. CRISI is a composite measure. Unlike the last one where they looked at individual measures, you'll see that we can do the same thing, but we also look at it in a composite way to characterize the resilience of socio-ecological systems in the context of governance and risk to natural hazards as opposed to climate change. Many natural hazards are related to climate change, but this is more retrospective in its use of information and not forecasting with regard to how climate change might alter those natural hazards. CRISI is comprised of 5 domains. One associated, you can see the picture here on your right, is a risk domain, governance, society, the built environment, and the natural environment. It's represented by 20 different indicators and 117 metrics. If we look at the comparison to the last presentation, when the presenter went through the 25 areas under each of the 5 major systems, she was looking at individual metrics that they were measuring. We use a system that also has large domains like were described in the previous presentation. Then we look at what indicators, which are not directly measurable, which are a compilation of lots of different types of things, represent that domain, and then look at the metrics that would go into determining those indicator measurements. As you can see, it builds from risk up through the natural environment. As you saw in one of the previous slides, very similarly, we look at going in one direction as creating more resilience and the other left, that each one of those domains can change in the same direction, as well as the indicators and the metrics. The intended use of CRISI is to help communities target potential areas for resources to increase their relative resilience given specific hazard profiles, and potentially to identify other communities who have successfully developed resilience in those areas that might be used as best practices, lessons learned, or as partner communities to help develop their individual approaches. This is a very busy slide. I'm not going to spend much time here because I'm going to go in depth in the following slides, but it's our summary slide for the domains and indicators. You can see the 5 domains and all of the indicators that create that. But in an overview of the domains, the risk domain looks at the characteristics of a place that contribute to its level of exposure or loss resulting from specific types of hazards. There are 2 indicators that we use there, exposure and loss. There are 18 metrics we use within exposure and 3 for loss. 13 of the metrics have to do with natural hazards and include spatial information that we can track on a 30 by 30 grid across the United States for hurricanes, tornadoes, inland flooding, coastal flooding, earthquakes, wildfires, drought, high winds, hail, landslides, extreme high temperature events, and extreme low temperature events. The technological hazards that we look at are the possibility that there may be exacerbating hazards that are not natural hazards that could enhance risk. These would be things like Superfund sites, nuclear power plants, reckless sites. As an example of that kind of interaction during Hurricane Harvey, which hit Texas in 2017. You may have seen in news reports that there were, after the flooding, a number of events that happened in the Houston area where petrochemical plants added to risk in areas due to flooding and destruction, fire, release of emissions from those types of facilities. Loss is looking at the historical loss of life and property in terms of human loss and dollars lost in the built environment and dollars lost in agricultural and natural resources. The governance domain looks at the collaboration of government agencies, NGOs, and private citizens toward joint objectives in creating a system of rules and regulations for increasing community resilience. They're much similar to what was previously talked about in terms of preparedness. We look at it in terms of three primary indicators: community preparedness. Those are rules and regs that are set down at the county or community level. In the U.S., many times those regulations are set down at the county level rather than individual communities, but for larger urban centers, they may have their own. Personal preparedness, things that individuals or households can do to protect their personal property from acute climate events. And natural resource conservation, or the protection of natural resources within an area that could ameliorate the potential for risk associated with one of these events. Within the built environment domain, which is looking at man-made surroundings that support human activities, and their structural vulnerabilities and critical functions for recovery, we're looking primarily at three types of infrastructure: communications infrastructure, which has 7 different metrics associated with it; utilities infrastructure relating to drinking water, sewerage, and power. There are 3 measurements there. Transportation infrastructure, which have to do with the flow and continuity of transportation, both before, during, and after an event. There's 6 measurements there. And then 2 measurements associated with housing characteristics. 2 major indicators, one associated with characteristics themselves. There are 5 measures that are associated with overcrowding, density, the type of housing, and the structural condition of the housing, and how many vacant structures there are in a particular area. And there are 3 measures that are associated with that. The natural environment domain looks at the resilience of natural and managed ecosystems. We look at that in terms of the extent or the distribution of the proportion of land that is undeveloped and the acreage that is in each of 9 different ecosystem types, and the condition of each of those ecosystem types. The societal environment domain looks at all aspects of the community except for the built environment, includes economic, demographic, and social interactions. This includes a lot of what you saw previously with regard to economics and well-being. That includes measurements associated with demographics, which might define the general vulnerability of attributes of a community's population. Economic diversity, factors that are associated with economic stability and the ability to monetarily respond and recover. Health characteristics, factors that are associated with healthcare access, special health vulnerability, populations and specific health problems. The location and availability of trade and labor services, essentially whether the appropriate construction skills needed to provide for accelerated recovery are in your specific area or have to be imported from elsewhere. Safety and security, which have to do with emergency and civil service activities. Social cohesion, the willingness within a community to bond together its members to cooperate, particularly in recovery efforts. Social services that are available but are unrelated to the labor and trade services that are above, and the safety and security and civil control. There are a lot of different services that can become involved both in vulnerability and recovery. And socioeconomics, looking at employment opportunities and issues associated with personal economics. Each of these metrics is determined for each of approximately 3,500 counties within the United States, and then combined to represent each of the indicators, and then normalized on a scale from 0 to 100 so that we can make them all unitless so that we can combine them to create domain scores. In order to create those domain scores, we look at resilience essentially in two parts. One is largely what I'll call basic resilience, and that is the ratio of the governance score to the risk score. And that relationship of governance divided by risk is calculated for each county. You have here the frequency of counties that are represented by that ratio. What we're looking for is clearly counties that have a score of less than 1, meaning that they have much less governance than they have risk. Potentially are counties that are at severe risk to these types of events. With scores of 1 to 3, we're talking about counties that vary, and depending on the specific type of risk, they're in a certain potential level of risk. Those that have scores that are 3 or greater generally are counties that have relatively little risk and have extensive amounts of governance. This isn't driven only by risk. You can be a county that has very little risk but very little governance and be in a situation where your basic resilience is poor even though your risk is relatively low. And these represent counties essentially that aren't generally exposed, but if they were to be exposed, would have little governance in place to allow them to react to that. And we just saw that in the last year in the Gulf Coast here along Florida and in Georgia when Hurricane Michael hit. The coastal counties had identified a lot of risk. They still got hit very badly. But when Hurricane Michael moved inward into the country and went into Georgia, there were many counties with very low risk likelihoods that suffered a tremendous amount of damage because they had next to no resilience, and many of their agricultural crops have essentially been eliminated, and they'll have to do major efforts in order to replace them. When you plot that governance versus risk, you end up essentially with 4 different types of communities. A are those communities that are like 3 to 5 or higher for basic risk. B and C are those that are about on the borderline, and D or any of the communities that are below the 45-degree line are those communities who have less governance than they have risk. And we can plot that so that we can see on the counties within the U.S. areas that have a high resilience, high basic resilience, and low basic resilience. The very light colors are those areas that represent low basic resilience. You can see that many of the areas in some of the tornado zones in the Midwest, the Appalachians, the Gulf Coast, and along the West Coast are represented by those areas of poor basic resilience. And generally, these are involved in the Appalachians in terms of inland flooding and landslides along the Gulf Coast with hurricanes and coastal flooding. The same with South Florida. In the West Coast, we're talking largely about earthquakes, wildfires, and some mudslides. We adjust that basic resilience score based on a community's ability to recover from those types of events. And we adjust that by creating a value for the society domain, the built domain, and the natural domain, and adjusting that based on the median for the country. So essentially you're above or below the median for the country. If you're far below the median, essentially you have a negative effect on overall general resilience. If you're far to the right of the median, you have a positive effect or ability to recover and increasing your resilience. And so you can see here that by that adjustment, it expands some of the areas that have low resilience, the light color, and particularly around the Ohio Valley and the lower Mississippi Valley, or lower Mississippi, and the Midwest. We can create numbers for these. These are national. Now remember, these are all measurements that are taken or created at the county level. They can be aggregated up to state. That can be aggregated to region, and that can be aggregated to the nation. So this is just an example of what the national CRISI scores look like. We do both calculations including Alaska and excluding Alaska, because about half of Alaska, or maybe 65% of Alaska, doesn't have enough information for us to be able to evaluate. So you can just see the numbers across here. There's nothing particular about these numbers other than the CRISI score for the nation for a county can run from roughly around -50 up to about 100. And this is just that map again, looking that in the mountainous areas that resilience is high, and in some areas in Alaska it's high, and these are largely because these are natural areas that when exposed to natural hazards recover relatively quickly. We can look at that CRISI overall. We can look at each one of the domains. We can blow this up and down and look at individual areas of the country. There are many different ways to look at this information. We can look at the potential hazards, where drought is one of the major hazards throughout the country, as is inland flooding and hail. Things like hurricanes and earthquakes have a much lower level, but for example, when you look at wildfires, in the east and in the south, they exist, but at about 1/10 of the exposure rate they do out in the west and mountainous areas. This just looks at areas where overall risk is very low. The lighter colors up in the northwest, and in 5 areas throughout the country where the scores overall for risk are relatively high. So essentially it's a score that runs from 0 to 1 or 0 to 100, depending on whether you look at it as a ratio or a percentage. Harris County, Texas is the area around Houston where there was so much damage as a result of Hurricane Harvey. We can start looking, this looks nationally at each one of those domain areas and look at what the primary contributors are. Risk is primarily driven by exposure as opposed to loss. Governance is impacted by the amount of preserved land that you have in your area to help ameliorate risk, but also as preparedness are major contributors for society, demographics, the type of population you are, how much of your population is at risk, either due to age or health, economic diversity, social cohesion. Those are important areas. And for the built environment, while infrastructures do contribute, the primary contributions had to do with housing characteristics and the number of vacant properties that there are in your particular area. We can break this down. In EPA, we use regions. This is the mountainous region that includes Montana, the Dakotas, Wyoming, Colorado, and we can look at the risk. You can see that it has an intermediate CRISI score. Most of the CRISI scores overall for regions range from about 1 to about 10. So you can see this CRISI score is roughly in the middle. It has relatively low risk, a relatively high amount of governance, roughly 3 to 5 times the amount that it has for risk. And you'll see two-tone bars here for society, built environment, and natural environment. The lighter color is the score for the domain, and the darker color is its contribution to recovery. In Region 8, there's a positive contribution from the societal elements, suggesting that it's roughly about plus 30% higher than the mean for the country. Built environment is about plus 10%. And actually in natural environment, there was a declination of a few percentages. And that may originally seem unlikely for this area of the United States, but remember that much of this area includes agricultural lands, which aren't considered natural lands, but managed lands. We can map those by those individual areas, and we have groups within the agency that are responsible for this area, and that allows them to look specifically. We could redo the analysis that wouldn't do the comparison on a national scale, but would do the comparison only within that region if we wanted to. That's essentially called changing the universe or changing the base population that you're looking at. We can begin to look at the specific risk statistics that are associated. Most things here have to do with drought and extremes of temperature. The exacerbating areas have to do with Superfund and what are called TRI, which are industrial effluents. Most of the losses have to do with dual benefit lands, meaning those that are both a combination of natural and man-made uses, like forestry and agriculture. And most of the exposure type is due to natural exposure. You can look at the ranges for the highest levels of resilience, the lowest, and the overall means. We can do that same type of evaluation overall for the country. In this case, it's looking at census regions within our country that compares, that shows that the lowest resilience occurs in this area in the east, south, central, and that the highest occur in New England and in New England and out in the west. We can do those same types of plots by each of those areas to look at differences that are associated with those areas. And where we're looking to in the future right now is an adaptation of CRISI to look specifically at the Superfund sites within the U.S., doing a retrospective analysis of the hurricane season that was in 17 and 18 as a retrospective check. Essentially, what would CRISI have said would be the counties that would be hardest hit by those events in terms of forest resilience, and whether indeed that turned out to be the case. Looking at an analysis of specific individual hazards rather than the integrated hazards of the 13 natural hazard events that we talked about. Looking at specific case studies at community levels. We're looking at some of those in the southeast and in the northwest. Working with EPA regions to assess specific research needs and support improvement of resilience. Part of that is helping counties look for other counties with similar risk structures to help them identify counties that have better resilience than them that they might partner with to do better, and looking at a what the relationship is between overall well-being and resilience. Um, Again, just the summary here is that the national assessments address widespread impacts of natural hazards and are helpful from a policy perspective, particularly in terms of investment in particular areas. That the assessments for specific areas are useful in identifying potential strengths and weaknesses and helping counties look for similar counties with similar hazard profiles and governance structures. CRISI allows you to drill down not only in scale, but also at the indicator level, which can be useful for targeting resources to increase resilience. But it's important to remember that CRISI is a starting point for resilience assessment. Locally held data, if yet they have it, can be used to supplement CRISI and make it a stronger measurement. There are lots of things that we might have liked to include in CRISI, but we don't have data for them for all counties in the U.S. Since this is being recorded or made available to you, these are places that you can go to learn more about CRISI, whether it's peer-reviewed journals or technical report. And with that, I guess we'll open it up for questions for both the presenters. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I definitely have a few questions myself. Now that we're going to start the question and answer period, if you do have a question that you'd like to pose to either of the or both of the presenters, you can type it into the question and answer box. And we'll be taking questions at any point. So we have about half an hour, and we'll just kind of see where we go from there. So the first question is around is for this, like, the Saskatchewan framework, and it asks, you know, if you need to have some sense of climate change impacts in order to be able to understand resilience. And so is there any, like, do you use forecasts or anything like that in order to determine sort of what the impact of some of those indicators are going to be, or the progress of those indicators?
Oh, hi, Jennifer. So
Hi.
Thank you for the question. And the answer to that is yes, you do need a sense of climate change impacts to understand resilience. So for Saskatchewan, we know that we can expect more extreme dry and wet times. So we're expecting that there's going to be increased risk for drought, flooding, and wildfires. And these are the types of impacts that we're trying to address in the climate change strategy and in the resilience framework. So we have programs and specific measures around forest management, fuel management, floodplain mapping, and the development of culverts, which would have higher capacity. So increase the capacity of culverts where there's higher risk for flooding. Now, I should also add Water Security Agency. So this is the agency that is responsible for managing water resources here in the province of Saskatchewan. They do consider future climate trends. And this is because they need to understand what's the climate change impacts on water supplies. And this informs whatever water management strategy they are developing. And they also do forecasting for stream flows. So this is to understand what's the impact on the watersheds. And then again, that would lead to whatever climate change adaptation initiative that they will be developing. I hope that answered the question.
Yes. So the next question is for both presenters. So resilience and adaptation are processes that take place over time. How do you deal with the time course of recovery?
I'll let you take a break since you answered the last question, and I'll start this one, and then you can add as well. For CRISI, it is a measure that we look at over time, and this particular instance, we were looking at 2005 through 2015. We are looking at annual updates. We're actually looking at ways to develop an artificial intelligence approach that allows us to automatically update this without someone having to go out and retrieve all of the information each time. But there are two types of time frames that you're talking about, I think here. One is where recovery can take place over a relatively short time frame in the sense of weeks or months, and the other is over a time frame of years. And at present, we're looking at both approaches, but we're not looking in terms of forecasting risks. We'd like to do that and will be doing that eventually. You can probably fill in the blanks as to why we're not doing it now. But we will be looking much more in the future in a forecasted sense, in which case overall indicators over time and their change over time becomes much more important. Saskatchewan.
Thank you, James. Just to add on to that, I think there's also a challenge in having a solid understanding on what the impacts of climate change is over the long term. So for Saskatchewan, we do, as I've said, we do annual reporting, and this allows for us to make some adjustments. Maybe there's an opportunity to look at other areas, maybe there are additional indicators that we should be capturing, or maybe we should be adjusting the target.
So it's a bit of a living document, is what you're saying. So yeah, they'll be continually be changed and updated as time progresses.
That's right. Yeah. So there's some flexibility built in.
Right.
That would be the same for both.
Okay. Okay. So I'm going to kind of combine the next two questions together. And this was definitely something that I was thinking about as I was listening to both of your presentations. So this first question is around you know, that there are always trade-offs between what you would like to measure and what you can measure based on the kind of data that you have available to you. So on one side, were there any kind of important gaps or components that you really would have liked to have had data for to include within these frameworks, but could not access, or that just don't exist? And then another kind of similar piece around that is, are there any sort of suggested indicators that have been identified that can be used to engage stakeholders in increasing resilience within communities? So the first is around data gaps, what you would like to see within your frameworks versus, you know, what's actually possible. And then the second question is around stakeholder engagement and the sorts of indicators that can be sort of used to help increase resilience within communities.
I think I could take a shot on this one, James, if that's okay with you, and then you could probably add on.
Go ahead.
So for Saskatchewan, when we were developing the framework, we wanted to include a measure around employment in the renewable energy sector. And so some of the measures that we have, we either depend on primary data or secondary data from Statistics Canada. And the data for employment for the renewable energy sector, it's not available in a disaggregated form. So much as we would have wanted to include something along that line, we realized it would take several months to get the data. And then again, timeliness is important for us because we do annual reporting. Another thing is we wanted to capture, there are certain data sets from Statistics Canada which are only available every 5 or 10 years, and sometimes that could be a problem again. If you want to see progress regularly, then that could be a challenge.
And similarly, we have, when we prepared CRISI, or when we worked on our Human Wellbeing Index, we essentially did what I call working from first principles. We didn't look at what was available. We looked at all of the domains and looked at what kind of indicators would we like to have, what kind of metrics would we like to have, and then we went out and tried to find them. To no one's surprise, the number of like to haves was significantly more than we could find. What that does, though, is allows us within the agency and outside the agency to talk about the types of gaps in information that would be useful to have. For example, there are many more governance measures that I think are might be useful. Most of what's available on the broad scale is information about flood insurance, insurance in general, and what I'll call disaster and recovery plans. There are much more specific types of information that we would like to have that's available in some places, but not broadly available. So yes, we can find those kinds of gaps. We also are looking at, as those are identified and potentially collected, what does it mean to bring them into the measure? How does it change both? And we can look at it retrospectively to see a direct change and how it might affect things as you go forward in the future. In terms of the question that had to do with engaging stakeholders, we're actually in the process of doing that in the Pacific Northwest with another tool where we've combined our Human Wellbeing Index with the CRISI Resilience Index, and are looking at to individual communities to help them better understand what their overall sustainability is in terms of identifying indicators and finding that indeed, obviously, different communities have different value structures and value different types of indicators differently. And we're creating a tool that allows them to go into these two indices, put in their information if indeed they have it, or look at scenario testing of what kind of community would they like to have and how might that affect the measurements. In addition, one of the criticisms of both indices is that they're at the county level. For resilience measures, that's not always that difficult because a lot of resilience activity is determined at the county level. But for well-being, clearly, it can be much more specific to an individual community. And so we're developing ways that allow us to create models, spatial models, to move from county measures down to census blocks within the U.S. To calculate both well-being and resilience. Hopefully that answers your questions.
Similar to that, so I was thinking around that issue of hard to find data as well, and I was wondering if there were any indicators that sort of within both of these frameworks where either the data wasn't available or not publicly available, right? So it either doesn't exist or it can't be accessed, that you've decided either A, to collect yourselves, develop a new indicator through any of the different provincial departments, for example, or to advocate for access to and sharing of that data.
Well, I can speak for us. We're not looking to create surveys or collect that information. That's honestly very difficult for us to do. But
right.
we have identified by them. We worked through surveys that do exist and that are allowed to add questions to collect information. While we don't do it ourselves, we can get it from sources that we're using. A lot of types of information that are closely held or economic, and particularly some insurance information. We've been advocating and having some success in getting things loosened up a little bit and looking at what the impacts are of that. In some cases, we ended up having something that we thought would really nail a specific area, and that wasn't available. So we had to have something that was in itself either, in our mind, logistically collinear with what was being measured, and using them as proxies for that type of measurement.
Hi, Jennifer. It's Dinah here. So to answer your question, we did both. So again, I'm going back to the example on employment for the renewable energy sector. Initially, we wanted to look at green economy employment. But again, we realized it's hard to get the disaggregated data. And then we also considered getting the data ourselves, but that would involve lots of work among different departments. And we decided that that's not an area that we would like to pursue. But one important, another component that was lacking data is around emergency preparedness plans for communities. So right now we don't have a good understanding of how many communities would have emergency preparedness plans and how good these emergency preparedness plans are, whether they've considered climate change impacts or not. So it was decided, including feedback from stakeholders, that this is a very important question and it is a very important information to have. So Ministry of Government Relations here at the Government of Saskatchewan has decided to do a survey to gather information on this one. And we have included a specific measure for this. And we haven't set the target yet, but this is something that we think is important for Saskatchewan. And again, we've decided to get the data ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know that just across Canada, StatsCan has been really engaging different populations and different groups, especially in the area of community data and what's available and what's desired, in order to be able to improve their sort of surveys and that sort of thing. And so that was partially why I was wondering, sort of, yeah, kind of where do you kind of bring all of that information together so that you can make sure that you have everything that you want to measure, that you need, that's important, right? And advocating both for the province of Saskatchewan, but also for the rest of the country, knowing that a lot of those data points are very important.
Yeah, and I think it's just because it's a new area, green economy. So most likely Stats Canada is going to be looking at how they're going to be presenting data in a disaggregated form that's more useful for different provinces and jurisdictions.
Right.
It's just quite new. That's why it's not
it's not
at the level that we want. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So we have a few more questions. So the next one is just that you've been mentioning a lot about the forecasting approach, but what about backcasting, which is also a very important aspect of sustainable development? So how do you use these indicators to backcast from a vision of success to a sustainable future?
And one of the things that I had said was that we were looking at a way to look at verification or validation by doing backcasts of different types of events and different types of histories, because otherwise we're left with taking the next 10 years to say whether or not this is working. So, we are looking specifically at backcasting, but also looking in terms of the potential for climate change as a forecasting approach. One of the important issues in both backcasting and forecasting is bringing the spatial range of the information down to the community level. So the different types of interpretive approaches that we were talking about would be increasing from 3,500 counties in the U.S. to approximately 150,000 reporting units. Bring it down to a much finer scale that is generally can be sometimes communities and sometimes neighborhoods. Depending on the type of resilience activity we're talking about, many communities essentially just adopt what's happening at the next larger level. So we don't have to do that type of spatial change, but we are looking actively looking at time both in a forward and backward direction.
And Kevin, I may have missed it, but when did CRISI officially launch?
CRISI as a report was finished at the end of 2017 and was launched out in 18. It's been out for about 9 months. And we're working within the U.S. to make sure people understand about it, but we're already working on how to improve it in a number of specific ways. This is an activity that was started in one administration and finished in another, so we're dealing with the issues that are associated with that as well.
For sure, and that kind of just led me to that a very similar question around whether or not you've had the opportunity to do any of that backcasting yet, and if you've been able to see a difference or a general change in the trend of resilience across in different jurisdictions across the country.
The only backcasting that I've completed was for Hurricane Harvey.
Okay.
And it specifically out of the 9 counties that were impacted by Hurricane Harvey, very clearly selected the two, 3 counties that were most impacted for the appropriate reasons. For example, in the lower part of Texas, Aransas County was decimated when the hurricane came ashore, but it was the result of winds and a large number of vacant structures that were easily blown down. And they had recovery issues because not all of the labor skills and trades were available to begin to work immediately. Whereas up in Harris County, it was a secondary effect from rain and flooding, which was a combination of the fact that development over time had eliminated most of the natural environments north of the city that had absorbed water up to that point, primarily prairie wetlands and other wetland facilities or ecosystems, and soil types in Houston, which combined to essentially make Houston a river for whatever water came from upstream. And it was the same for Chambers County, which was adjacent to that. So it looked at the same types. It looked at that event. It picked the right counties that were most impacted. It picked the right reasons for why they were impacted, and looked easily toward the future for the types of things that would need to be improved in order for them to be more resilient to those types of events in the future.
And I guess since then, have they seen any sort of improvements in around governance or in any of the other domains? Or is that kind of a work in progress, I guess?
This is an event that happened late in 2017.
Okay.
they haven't even completely recovered from the immediate impacts. So there haven't been a lot of demonstrable changes in terms of governance and other things, other than they're talking about doing them, but they haven't done them yet. Same thing is true for the West with regard to wildfire season of 2018 and the Gulf and Southeast for the hurricane season of 2018. All of those are areas that are in the process of recovering and are in the process of looking at what they need to do in order to be more resilient in the future.
Okay.
As you can appreciate, I'm sure these are timescales that in terms of changes in government and changes in behavior often take years rather than shorter periods of months.
Definitely. I just think about, New York after what was the hurricane in 2010, and how they went about implementing sort of build back better strategies within their infrastructure, and developing a more like a strategy around resilience, in order to improve resilience around climate events.
For that event, which we've also done a retrospective, New York has been much more proactive in developing those types of strategy, even though their direct damage was much less than New Jersey. New Jersey has been much slower there.
Okay. So just a few more questions. We have about 10 minutes. So are there any plans to measure the long-term impacts of the measures that you're implementing right now? So this is often a big challenge for cities and countries that implement resilience and adaptation. So they often have trouble measuring the impact related to climate hazards.
So for Saskatchewan, as I said in my presentation, we are trying to capture the capacities that we have to deal with climate change impacts. So we're not measuring the impacts of climate change because, again, as you've pointed out, it's very challenging to measure impacts. And how do you decide whether reducing the impacts of climate change is due to the climate change adaptation actions that you did, or maybe it's just because there's not a big difference in, say, weather events.
Perfect. And then one of the strengths of CRISI is the geographic differentiation. But even within counties, you may have very big differences between households in terms of preparedness and ability to respond to events. How do you capture these kinds of distributional effects?
That was one of the areas that we talked about, essentially working to create models that allow us to go to a smaller spatial scale from county to allow us to look at communities or neighborhoods. We doubt seriously we're going to be able to go down to individuals, but the point there is that in many cases in areas of the country, that county scale works just fine. In other areas, particularly those that are larger urban areas, they may have their own types of approaches. But one of the things, and this came primarily from initial reviews of CRISI and some of the community engagement of bringing things down to their specific scale. They understood those things that worked at a larger area, but they wanted to see some more things that were very specific to them, and that's what we're working on now.
And then for the Saskatchewan situation, so is there a plan for including those distributional effects? I know that you spoke a bit about the wildfire risk assessments, for example, that would be primarily within the north.
Yeah, those will be within the north. So because we know that those are the communities which are more, those are the communities which have higher risk to wildfires. And again, we also look at emergency preparedness plans for communities. So those will include both the larger cities and the smaller communities.
Okay. And then finally, for both cases, for both presenters, who uses these indicators now, and or I guess once the report comes out in Saskatchewan, and how are they typically used? Like, what action is likely to result from them, and by whom?
So for Saskatchewan, the measures that we have, the objective of those is to capture what progress we have in existing programs, and we may develop additional programs to further increase our progress. But what I'm trying to say is we already have climate change adaptation actions going on in the province. And what we're trying to do is capture how well we are progressing.
So it's a bit of a roadmap.
It is, yeah. And I think what we, sorry, James, this one more addition is that what we realized when we went and engaged with other ministries and agencies in the province is that a number of people are already doing climate change adaptation. It's not just being framed that way. And it's probably the same for other jurisdictions.
Right. And for us, we're looking at multiple scales of how to use the indicators at regional scales within the agency. They're looking at these comparisons to look at potential resource investments in different areas, which counties or which collections of counties might benefit most from investment in a particular area, which counties can we team up in attempts to learn from each other, and in terms of how are they typically being used now and what actions are likely to result. In the Northwest, we're working with a handful of specific communities that have populations of less than 40,000, and they're looking through bringing those polar plots down to their specific level and creating what I didn't talk about in both the human well-being and in CRISI are the ability to create weighting factors. Everything that we've done in both has allowed all of the domains to be involved in the index calculation equally. Some communities have different value structures where they value one thing more highly than another, and we're allowing them to look at what the impacts of those value structures are, and being able to do scenario testing of looking at specific activities or actions that they might do, and how through some of the interactional modeling that we've done between services that a county or community can provide, how those translate into potential changes in domains, whether of well-being or of resilience, and allowing them to do those evaluations in a computer dashboard kind of environment that helps them look at decision planning.
Wonderful. So we have 2 minutes left. With that, I'm just going to say thank you very much to both Kevin and Dinah for your presentations today. I know I personally learned a lot, and I will have a number of questions for you afterwards as well, following up. If anyone does have any additional questions for the presenters, please feel free to reach out to me and I can put you in contact with them at any point.
And thank you for inviting me. And if anyone does have anything for Jennifer, please just give them my email and they can contact me directly. Perfect.
I'm more than happy to do that. And at this point, again, just thank you very much to both of you. I will be providing the recording of this presentation as well as the materials through the CSIN email list. If you're not on that list, but you would like to to get a copy. That you can just email me at jtemmer@iisd.ca. Also, we have a Twitter feed if you're interested in different webinar events or information that we put out. You can follow us on Twitter, and we also have a LinkedIn group that you can join as well. So with that, I will say thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.